The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, innocuous enough among the usual bills and advertisements. White, official-looking, with the Willowbrook Homeowners Association logo stamped in gold foil across the corner. I almost tossed it with the junk mail. I wish I had. The coffee maker gurgled its last drops as I tore open the seal, expecting another reminder about lawn maintenance or parking violations. Instead, my world tilted sideways. The number jumped off the page like a physical blow. $200,000. $200,000. My hands trembled as I read it again, hoping my eyes had played tricks on me. But there it was, in stark black and white. Final notice of assessment. Accumulated fines and penalties. The document was thick, official, and utterly devastating. I sank into my kitchen chair, the morning sunlight streaming through the window suddenly feeling cold against my skin. The distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower seemed to mock the silence that had swallowed my thoughts. This wasn't just a fine. This was financial annihilation. The letter detailed a litany of alleged violations stretching back 18 months. Unauthorized exterior modifications, violation of landscape ordinances, failure to comply with architectural guidelines, and dozens more. Each infraction carried penalties that had apparently been compounding with interest, late fees, and administrative costs. I stared at my modest two-story colonial through the kitchen window. What unauthorized modifications? The small herb garden I'd planted last spring? The new mailbox that matched the exact specifications in their guidelines? The fresh coat of paint in the pre-approved color palette? My phone buzzed. A text from my neighbor, Mrs. Chen. "Did you get one too?" My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about me. The burnt smell of forgotten coffee filled the kitchen as I abandoned the pot and rushed outside. The October air bit at my cheeks as I jogged across the street to where Mrs. Chen stood on her porch, clutching an identical white envelope. $68,000, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling maple leaves, for planting roses without approval and having the wrong shade of shutters. 3 houses down, I could see Mr. Rodriguez standing in his driveway, his own letters scattered at his feet like fallen snow. The Patels were huddled by their front door, both holding phones to their ears, their faces pale with shock. This wasn't a billing error. This was a coordinated attack. Back in my kitchen, I spread the letter across the granite countertop and studied every word. The violations were dated precisely, documented with photos, and cross-referenced with specific bylaw numbers. Someone had been watching us, cataloging our every move, building cases against us like we were criminals. But why now? Why all at once? The answer came buried in the fine print at the bottom of the 3rd page. Payment must be received within 30 days of notice date, or legal proceedings will commence to place liens on properties and initiate foreclosure procedures. Foreclosure. They wanted our homes. I thought about the HOA meetings I'd attended sporadically over the past 2 years. The stern faces of the board members, led by their imperious president, Margaret Whitmore, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and predatory smile. The way they'd nod in unison when she spoke, like marionettes dancing to her tune. There had been whispers about financial troubles, about the community center renovations going over budget, about legal fees mounting from various disputes. But this was extortion dressed up in legal language. My phone rang, jolting me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed my brother Jake's number. "Did you see the news?" he asked without preamble. "What news?" "Turn on Channel 7. There's something about your neighborhood." I fumbled for the remote, my heart hammering against my ribs. The local news anchor's voice filled the room. Unprecedented action by the Willowbrook Homeowners Association, issuing what sources say are millions of dollars in fines to residents across the community. We have reports of individual fines ranging from $20,000 to over $200,000. The screen showed footage of my street. Neighbors gathered in clusters, their faces a mixture of shock and rage. Mrs. Chen was being interviewed, tears streaming down her cheeks as she explained how the fine would force her to sell the home she'd lived in for 30 years. "This is bigger than I thought," Jake said quietly. I turned off the TV, the silence rushing back like a tide. $200,000. I ran the numbers in my head, my savings, my retirement account, the equity in my house. Even if I liquidated everything, I'd come up short. And that was assuming I could access the funds before the 30-day deadline. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my living room as I sat there, the letter still clutched in my hands. Outside, the sound of normal life continued. Children playing, dogs barking, the distant rumble of delivery trucks. But inside my house, everything had changed. I thought about my grandmother, who had lived in this house before me. She'd always said that bullies only understood one language: strength. But how do you fight an organization with lawyers, bylaws, and the power to take your home? The answer would come to me in the days ahead, buried in old documents and forgotten family history. But for now, I sat in the gathering darkness, clutching that devastating letter, and wondered if this was how wars began. Not with grand declarations, but with quiet moments of absolute determination. Because one thing had become crystal clear: I wasn't going to pay their ransom, and I wasn't going to let them destroy my community. The fight was just beginning. Willowbrook had always been a paradox, wrapped in perfectly manicured lawns and color-coordinated shutters. From the outside, it looked like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Tree-lined streets, where children rode bicycles and neighbors waved from their porches. The kind of place where the American dream was supposed to live and breathe. I'd fallen in love with it the moment I first drove through 3 years ago. The realtor had smiled knowingly as we toured house after house, each one more charming than the last. "It's a special community," she'd said, her voice carrying that practiced enthusiasm of someone who'd given the same speech 100 times. "The HOA really maintains standards here." Standards. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have run screaming from that word. The Willowbrook Homeowners Association had been established in 1987, back when the neighborhood was just a developer's dream scrawled on blueprints. Like most HOAs, it had started with good intentions, maintaining property values, organizing community events, keeping the streets clean and safe. But somewhere along the way, those good intentions had curdled into something darker. Margaret Whitmore had been HOA President for 7 years, ever since she'd moved into the largest house on Elm Street after her divorce settlement. She was the kind of woman who wore pearls to grocery shopping and spoke in clipped, measured tones that somehow managed to sound both polite and threatening. Her smile never reached her eyes, and she had a way of making every conversation feel like a performance she was directing. At my first HOA meeting, I'd watched her operate with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. She'd stand at the podium in the community center, her silver hair catching the fluorescent lights, and deliver reports on everything from landscaping contracts to noise ordinances. The other board members, Robert Sterling, a retired accountant with nervous eyes, Patricia Vance, whose primary qualification seemed to be unwavering loyalty to Margaret, and David Kim, a lawyer who rarely spoke but nodded at everything, sat in a perfect row behind her like backup singers. But it was what happened after the meetings that told the real story. I'd lingered once, helping stack chairs and collecting forgotten coffee cups, when I overheard Margaret talking to Patricia in hushed tones near the storage closet. "The Henderson property is underwater on their mortgage," Margaret had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Robert says they're 3 months behind. If we can document enough violations—" Patricia had nodded eagerly. "The fence height issue? Among other things. We need to be thorough, professional." I'd pretended not to hear, finishing my cleanup and leaving through the back exit. But the conversation had stuck with me. a splinter of unease that grew larger with each passing month. The signs had been there if you knew how to look. The way certain residents would go quiet when Margaret entered a room, the nervous glances when violation notices were discussed, the fact that several longtime residents had suddenly put their houses on the market, citing family reasons or job relocations that seemed to come out of nowhere. There was Jenny Morrison, who'd lived on Oak Avenue for 15 years before suddenly moving out in the middle of the night. Her house sat empty for months, a for sale sign planted in the yard like a funeral marker. The rumors said she'd been hit with $40,000 in fines for having the wrong type of fence. But when I'd tried to ask around, people would just shake their heads and change the subject. Then there was Tom Bradley, the veteran who'd lived in the corner house with the American flag always flying in his front yard. One day the flag was gone, the windows were dark, and a foreclosure notice was taped to his front door. Margaret had mentioned at the next meeting that the property would be an excellent opportunity for the right buyer to contribute positively to our community standards. The pattern was becoming clear, but it wasn't until I started paying closer attention that I realized how systematic it all was. The HOA had developed what they called the Community Excellence Initiative, a comprehensive program to enhance property values through strict adherence to established guidelines. It sounded official, even admirable, but in practice, it was a weapon of mass gentrification, designed to push out longtime residents who couldn't afford to keep up with increasingly arbitrary and expensive requirements. They'd started small, minor infractions that carried modest fines, a mailbox that was 6 inches too tall, grass that was a 1/4 inch over the regulation height, flower beds that contained non-approved plants. Most residents would pay the fines rather than fight, not realizing they were being cataloged in a growing database of violations. Then came the escalation. Repeat offenders found their fines doubling, tripling, compounding with interest and administrative fees. The HOA had hired a property management company that specialized in aggressive enforcement, complete with professional photographers who would document violations with the precision of crime scene investigators. I'd seen them around the neighborhood, men and women in polo shirts carrying clipboards and cameras, measuring fence heights and photographing paint colors. They worked in teams, systematically covering every street, every house, every blade of grass that might be deemed out of compliance. The genius of it was how legal it all appeared. Every fine was backed by a specific bylaw. Every penalty was properly documented. Every notice was delivered according to the proper procedures. From the outside, it looked like a well-run organization maintaining community standards. From the inside, it felt like living under occupation. But Margaret had made one critical mistake. She'd gotten greedy. The $200,000 fine wasn't just about driving me out. It was about making an example. She wanted the entire neighborhood to see what happened to people who didn't fall in line. She wanted fear to do the work that lawyers and liens couldn't accomplish quickly enough. What she didn't know was that fear can cut both ways. And sometimes, when you push someone far enough, they don't run, they push back. As I sat in my kitchen that evening, watching the sun set over the perfectly maintained lawns and regulation-compliant driveways, I realized that Willowbrook's quiet streets had been hiding a war zone all along. The real battle wasn't about paint colors or mailbox heights or flower bed specifications. It was about power, about who got to decide what home meant, about whether a community belonged to the people who lived in it or to the people who controlled it. Margaret Whitmore had spent 7 years building her empire of rules and regulations, turning neighbors into informants and homes into hostages. She'd created a system where fear masqueraded as order, where compliance was purchased with dignity, and where community meant conformity. But she'd also made the mistake of assuming that everyone would bend the knee when, faced with financial ruin, she was about to learn how wrong she was. The harassment began exactly 48 hours after the $200,000 notice arrived. I was in my home office, trying to focus on work while fielding calls from panicked neighbors, when I heard the rumble of a diesel engine outside. Through my window, I watched a tow truck hook up to my car, sitting legally in my own driveway. "Hey!" I shouted, running outside in my slippers. "What are you doing?" The driver, a burly man in oil-stained coveralls, barely looked up from his clipboard. "Got a work order. Unauthorized vehicle storage in violation of HOA regulations. That's my car, in my driveway." He shrugged, uninterested in the logic of the situation. "Take it up with your HOA. I just follow orders." I stood there in my pajamas, watching my Honda Accord disappear down the street like a kidnapped family member. The paperwork he'd handed me cited Violation Code 7.3b, extended parking of recreational or commercial vehicles. My four-door sedan had somehow been reclassified as a commercial vehicle because of a small equipment bag visible in the back seat. This was war. The phone calls started that afternoon. Robocalls every 30 minutes, with Margaret's voice delivering the same message. "This is a reminder that your HOA assessment payment is now overdue. Failure to remit payment within the specified time frame may result in additional penalties and legal action." When I tried to block the number, they switched to a different one, then another. By evening, my phone was buzzing so constantly that I had to turn it off just to think straight. But they were just getting started. The next morning, I found my garbage cans had been zip-tied to my fence with a violation notice attached. Improper refuse container placement. Never mind that I'd put them out exactly where they'd been every week for 3 years. The notice included a $500 fine and a demand that I remove them immediately. But the zip ties were industrial strength, and I had to use bolt cutters to free my own trash cans. That afternoon, a city inspector showed up at my door with a clipboard and a serious expression. Someone had filed a complaint about suspected unpermitted modifications to my house. He spent 2 hours crawling through my attic, basement, and crawl spaces, looking for evidence of electrical or plumbing work that hadn't been properly permitted. Whoever called this in was pretty specific, he told me as he packed up his equipment. They had detailed knowledge of your house layout and recent purchases. Said you'd been doing work without permits. He found nothing, of course, because there was nothing to find. But the message was clear. They were watching. They knew what I bought, when I bought it, and how I used it. The campaign of petty terrorism escalated daily. My mail stopped arriving. The post office said they'd received complaints about my mailbox being improperly positioned and had suspended delivery pending resolution. My internet was mysteriously disconnected when the cable company received an authorized service termination request from someone claiming to be me. My water was shut off for non-payment of a bill I'd paid 2 weeks early. Each incident required hours on the phone, navigating customer service labyrinths, providing identification, and explaining that I hadn't authorized any changes to my services. The companies were apologetic but firm. They'd received official requests, complete with account numbers and security information that only I should have had access to. Someone was inside my life, pulling strings I didn't know existed. The psychological warfare was even more insidious. I'd come home to find my garden hose coiled in impossible knots, my recycling bins moved to my neighbor's driveway, and mysterious piles of dog waste deposited precisely on my property line. Nothing I could prove, nothing that would hold up in court, but a constant reminder that my privacy and security were illusory. My neighbors were suffering similar harassment, but the patterns were tailored to individual vulnerabilities. Mrs. Chen's flower beds were repeatedly vandalized, with plants uprooted and replaced with weeds. Mr. Rodriguez found his car windows covered, with flyers advertising deportation services and immigration legal help, AIDHOM, not-so-subtle message targeting his ethnicity. The Patel's mailbox was repeatedly stuffed with pork products, a deliberate insult to their religious beliefs. The message was consistent. You don't belong here, and we'll make your life miserable until you leave. But it was the incident with Sarah Mackenzie that made me realize how dangerous this had become. Sarah was a single mother who lived 3 houses down with her 8-year-old daughter, Emma. She worked 2 jobs to afford the mortgage on her small ranch house and had been struggling to keep up with the increasingly expensive HOA requirements. Her fine had been only $35,000, but it might as well have been $1 million to someone living paycheck to paycheck. I found her crying on her front porch one Tuesday morning, holding a letter from Child Protective Services. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint alleging that she was neglecting Emma, leaving her alone for extended periods, failing to provide adequate nutrition, and maintaining an unsafe living environment. They came to the school, Sarah sobbed. They pulled Emma out of class and questioned her about our home life. She was terrified. She didn't understand what was happening. The CPS investigation was thorough and invasive. Social workers interviewed Emma multiple times, inspected every room of their house, and required Sarah to provide documentation of her work schedules, Emma's medical records, and their family finances. The investigation found no evidence of neglect or abuse, but the trauma was done. Emma started having nightmares and refused to walk home from the school bus alone. That's when I realized Margaret Whitmore and her board weren't just trying to drive us out. They were willing to destroy families to achieve their goals. I started documenting everything, every phone call, every suspicious incident, every violation notice. I bought security cameras and installed them around my property. I kept detailed logs of when services were disrupted and which companies were involved. I photographed every instance of vandalism and harassment, but the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Robert Sterling, the nervous accountant who served on the HOA board, showed up at my door one evening just as the sun was setting. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if he expected to be followed, and his hands shook as he handed me a manila envelope. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. "What they're doing, it's not legal. It's not right." Inside the envelope were photocopies of internal HOA documents that revealed the scope of their operation, email chains between board members discussing problem residents, detailed financial analyses of each targeted property, communications with the property management company about acceleration of enforcement procedures. But the most damning document was a spreadsheet titled Acquisition Targets. It listed 43 properties in Willowbrook, complete with current market values, estimated fine potential, and acquisition timelines. My house was listed with a target date of December 2024, and a note, "Primary residence, maximum pressure tactics approved." They weren't just collecting fines. They were systematically targeting specific properties for forced sale, with the goal of acquiring them at below-market prices. The HOA had partnered with a development company that would purchase the foreclosed properties, renovate them to luxury standards, and resell them at massive profits. It was a real estate scam dressed up as community management. Robert Sterling had brought me the smoking gun, but he'd also signed his own death warrant in the process. Within a week, his house was hit with $150,000 in retroactive fines, and his own name appeared on the acquisition targets spreadsheet. The war had escalated beyond individual harassment. This was organized, systematic, and profitable. Margaret Whitmore had turned our neighborhood into a corporate asset to be strip-mined, with our homes as the raw materials and our families as acceptable collateral damage. But she'd made one critical miscalculation. She'd assumed that fear and isolation would keep us from fighting back. She'd counted on us accepting our fate quietly, the way so many others had before us. She was about to discover that some people don't break under pressure. They sharpen themselves against it, and I was about to reveal a secret weapon that would turn her entire operation upside down. The revelation came buried in a dusty cardboard box in my grandmother's attic. Discovered during a weekend of sorting through family documents I'd been putting off for months. I'd been looking for my grandfather's military records when my fingers found something unexpected. A thick folder labeled Property Holdings, Whitmore County. I almost set it aside with the other business papers. My grandfather had been a small-time real estate investor. Nothing glamorous or particularly profitable. But something about the date caught my eye. The documents were from 1962, and they concerned a property acquisition in downtown Whitmore, just 15 miles from where I now sat fighting for my home. The deed was yellow with age, its formal language dense with legal terminology that required careful reading. But as the words sank in, my heart began to pound with something between disbelief and explosive hope. Property description. The Whitmore County Courthouse building and surrounding grounds, consisting of 2.3 acres located at 100 Justice Boulevard, Whitmore, Pennsylvania. Purchased from Whitmore County for the sum of $15,000. In consideration of tax obligations and municipal debt restructuring. Read it 3 times before the full. Implications hit me. My grandfather had bought the courthouse. The same courthouse where HOA disputes were adjudicated. The same courthouse where property lines were filed and foreclosure proceedings were initiated. The same courthouse where Margaret Whitmore's legal machinery was supposed to crush me and my neighbors into submission. I dug deeper into the box, finding maintenance records, property tax payments, and correspondence with various county officials spanning decades. My grandfather had acquired the building during a period of municipal financial crisis, when the county was desperately selling assets to avoid bankruptcy. He'd held onto it as a long-term investment, leasing it back to the county for their continued use as a courthouse. When he died in 1998, the property had passed to my grandmother. When she died 5 years ago, it had passed to me, along with dozens of other small properties I'd never bothered to investigate. My lawyer had handled the estate transfer, and I'd signed papers without paying much attention to the details. The monthly lease payments were automatically deposited into an account I rarely checked. Just another small income stream among several. I'd owned the courthouse for 5 years without knowing it. The current lease agreement, buried deeper in the box, was a revelation in itself. The county had been paying below-market rent for decades, locked into a sweetheart deal that my grandfather had agreed to out of civic duty. But the lease was coming up for renewal in 6 months, and the terms gave me extraordinary leverage as the property owner. More importantly, as the building owner, I had certain rights that even the county couldn't override. The courthouse might house the legal system, but I owned the physical space where that system operated. I spent the rest of the weekend on the phone with lawyers, property managers, and local government officials, piecing together the full picture of what I'd inherited. The news got better with each conversation. The courthouse was profitable, more profitable than I'd realized. The county lease covered basic operating costs, but I also owned the parking garage, the ground floor retail spaces, and had mineral rights to the entire property. Various tenants, from bail bondsmen to court reporters, paid additional rent for office space in the building. But it was my conversation with Harold Brennan, a real estate attorney who'd worked with my grandfather, that revealed the true scope of my leverage. "Your grandfather was a smart man," Harold told me over coffee at his downtown office. "He negotiated language into that lease that most property owners never think about. You have approval rights over any substantial changes to building usage or occupancy. That includes any modifications to courtroom assignments, security procedures, or access policies." The implications were staggering. Margaret Whitmore could file all the lawsuits she wanted, but if I decided to restrict access to the courthouse or modify the terms under which HOA disputes were heard, I could effectively shut down her legal machinery. "What about eminent domain?" I asked. "Couldn't the county just seize the property?" Harold shook his head. "Not easily. Your grandfather's lease includes language that specifically protects against government seizure, except in cases of genuine public emergency. And even then, you'd be entitled to fair market compensation, which would be substantial given the property's location and income potential. I left Harold's office with a thick folder of legal documents and a growing sense that the battlefield had just tilted dramatically in my favor. But I also knew that knowledge alone wouldn't be enough. Margaret Whitmore had spent years building her empire of harassment and intimidation. She had lawyers, resources, and a ruthless willingness to destroy people's lives for profit. I needed allies, and I needed a plan. The first call I made was to Robert Sterling, the former HOA board member who'd leaked the internal documents. He answered on the first ring, his voice tense with paranoia. "We need to meet," I told him, "but not at either of our houses. They're watching." We agreed to meet at a diner 20 miles outside of Willowbrook, far enough from Margaret's surveillance network to speak freely. When I told him about the courthouse, his nervous energy transformed into something approaching excitement. "Do you understand what this means?" he said, leaning across the booth with wide eyes. "Every single legal action the HOA has taken for the past 5 years, every lien, every foreclosure, every court order, they've all been processed through your building. You have access to records, filing procedures, scheduling. You could control the entire timeline of their legal operations." The plan began to take shape over coffee and pie in that roadside diner. Robert had inside knowledge of the HOA's operations and financial structure. I had leverage over the legal system they depended on. Together, we could build a case that would expose their fraud and corruption while protecting the targeted homeowners. But we needed more than just evidence. We needed public attention, media coverage, and legal representation that could stand up to Margaret's well-funded attack machine. That's when Robert mentioned Patricia Vance's ex-husband. "David's a journalist," he said. "Investigative reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Patricia always complained about him, said he was obsessed with corruption stories and wouldn't let sleeping dogs lie. She'd probably hate knowing we were talking to him, which makes it perfect." David Vance turned out to be exactly what we needed. A seasoned investigative journalist with a particular interest in HOA abuse cases. He'd been following the broader trend of predatory homeowners associations for years, documenting how they'd evolved from community service organizations into profit-driven operations that preyed on vulnerable residents. When I called him and explained our situation, his interest was immediate and intense. "HOA foreclosure scams are becoming epidemic," he told me during our first phone conversation. "But most victims don't have the resources to fight back effectively. If you really own the courthouse where these cases are being processed, this could be the story that breaks the whole model wide open." We agreed to meet the following week, but I insisted on absolute secrecy. Margaret Whitmore had already demonstrated her willingness to use intimidation and harassment against anyone who opposed her. If she learned about my courthouse ownership before we were ready to use it strategically, she might find ways to neutralize the advantage. As I drove home from the diner that evening, passing through the perfectly manicured streets of Willowbrook, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. Hope. Margaret Whitmore had built her empire on the assumption that individual homeowners were powerless against organized institutional harassment. She'd counted on our isolation, our financial limitations, and our ignorance of the legal system she'd weaponized against us. But she'd never counted on the possibility that one of her victims might own the very foundation of her legal strategy. The courthouse steps where she planned to crush our resistance would become the stage for her downfall. The legal system she'd corrupted for profit would become the instrument of justice. Margaret Whitmore was about to learn that some battles aren't won by the side with the most lawyers or the biggest war chest. Sometimes they're won by the side that owns the courthouse. The first meeting of what would become known as the Willowbrook Resistance took place in Sarah Mackenzie's living room on a rainy Thursday evening in late October. The 7 of us who gathered there represented more than just individual homeowners fighting impossible fines. We were the survivors of Margaret Whitmore's systematic campaign of harassment, and we each brought unique skills to the table. Sarah had insisted on hosting despite the risk. "They've already tried to destroy my family," she said, when I suggested we meet somewhere else. "I'm not going to let them make me afraid to have friends in my own home." Mrs. Chen arrived first, carrying a thermos of tea and a manila folder thick with documentation. At 73, she was the neighborhood's unofficial historian, having lived in Willowbrook longer than anyone except the original residents. Her knowledge of property boundaries, historical agreements, and long-forgotten HOA bylaws would prove invaluable in the days ahead. Mr. Rodriguez came next, bringing with him a quiet intensity that spoke of battles fought and won. His fine had been targeted specifically at his family's heritage, violations related to the small Mexican flag he flew during cultural holidays, the unapproved colors he'd painted his front door, and the commercial activity of his wife's small catering business run from their kitchen. But Miguel Rodriguez was a retired union organizer who understood, better than any of us, how to build coalitions and sustain long-term resistance. Movements, the Patels, Rajesh, and Meera brought technical expertise that would prove crucial. Rajesh was a software engineer who'd already begun analyzing the patterns in HOA violation notices, looking for evidence of systematic targeting. Meera was a paralegal who understood the legal procedures Margaret's team was using against us. Together, they represented the kind of methodical, analytical approach we'd need to build an airtight case. Robert Sterling was our inside source, the former board member whose conscience had finally overcome his fear. He came loaded with copies of internal documents, financial records, and email chains that revealed the true scope of the HOA's operations. His nervous energy had crystallized into focused determination. He knew better than anyone how much damage Margaret could do if we failed. And then there was David Vance, Patricia's ex-husband, who arrived last with a laptop bag and the kind of focused intensity that comes from years of investigative journalism. He'd been following HOA abuse stories across the country, but he'd never seen a case with this level of systematic fraud and the unique leverage point that my courthouse ownership provided. "Before we start," I said, as we settled into Sarah's living room, "everyone needs to understand what we're risking here. Margaret has already demonstrated that she'll target families, harass children, and use government agencies as weapons against people who oppose her. If we do this, we're all going to become bigger targets than we already are." Mrs. Chen set down her teacup with the kind of deliberate care that spoke volumes. "My dear," she said, in her soft, precise voice, "I came to this country with nothing but hope and determination. I built a life here, raised my children here, buried my husband in the cemetery down the road. I am not going to let some petty tyrant steal my home because she thinks fear is stronger than community." Miguel nodded grimly. "I've fought worse battles than this, but I've also learned that you can't win by playing defense forever. Eventually, you have to go on the attack." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her neighbors, people who'd become her chosen family over the years of school events, block parties, and shared struggles. "Emma asked me yesterday if we were going to have to move again. She's 8 years old and she's already learned that home isn't permanent. I won't let Margaret Whitmore teach my daughter that bullies always win." With our commitment established, we began to organize. David Vance laid out the media strategy. The story has all the elements that make for powerful journalism: systemic corruption, vulnerable victims, and a David versus Goliath narrative. But we need more than just emotional impact. We need documented evidence, verifiable sources, and a clear timeline that shows the pattern of illegal behavior. Rajesh had brought printouts of his data analysis, spreadsheets that revealed the methodical nature of Margaret's targeting. "The violation patterns aren't random," he explained, pointing to charts and graphs that made the harassment visible in stark numerical terms. Certain demographic groups are cited at rates 3 to 4 times higher than others: elderly residents, single parents, minorities. And anyone who's spoken out at HOA meetings face significantly more scrutiny. Mira had researched the legal framework surrounding HOA operations in Pennsylvania. The problem is that most HOA enforcement is technically legal under current state law, even when it's clearly abusive. But Margaret's operation crosses several lines into criminal territory, specifically around fraud, conspiracy, and violation of fair housing protections. Robert Sterling's inside knowledge provided the roadmap to Margaret's financial operations. The development company they're partnering with is called Whitmore Premium Properties. And yes, Margaret is a silent partner. They've already acquired 12 properties in the neighborhood through this forced foreclosure scheme. The profit margins are enormous because they're buying homes at 30 to 40% below market value. Mrs. Chen had brought historical documents that revealed another crucial piece of the puzzle. The original HOA charter from 1987 includes provisions that the current board has been ignoring, she said, spreading yellowed papers across Sarah's coffee table. Homeowners have the right to call for board elections with a petition signed by just 25% of residents. They've been suppressing that information for years. The plan that emerged over the next 3 hours was comprehensive and aggressive. We would fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, using our combined resources to maximum effect. David would begin working on the exposé, building a detailed narrative of Margaret's operations with documentation that could withstand legal scrutiny. His story would need to be bulletproof because Margaret would undoubtedly try to silence it through litigation or intimidation. Rajesh and Mira would focus on building the legal case, documenting violations of fair housing law, and gathering evidence of fraudulent billing practices. They would also research precedent cases in other states where similar HOA schemes had been successfully challenged. Miguel would handle community organizing, reaching out to other affected residents and building the coalition we'd need to sustain a long-term fight. His experience with union organizing gave him insight into how to maintain morale and momentum when the opposition had superior resources. Mrs. Chen would research the historical and legal foundation of our community, looking for forgotten agreements or legal precedents that might provide additional leverage against Margaret's operations. Robert would continue providing inside intelligence while we prepared for the likelihood that his role would be discovered. He was prepared to face retaliation, but we agreed to move as quickly as possible to minimize his exposure. Sarah would coordinate communications and serve as our primary spokesperson, a role that was both strategic and symbolic. As a single mother fighting to protect her daughter's home, she represented the human cost of Margaret's greed in ways that would resonate with media and potential allies. And I would use my courthouse ownership strategically, both as leverage in negotiations and as a tool for gathering intelligence about Margaret's legal operations. But it was Mrs. Chen who provided the insight that would guide everything we did going forward. Margaret Whitmore believes that fear is her greatest weapon, she said as our meeting wound down. She thinks that if she can isolate us and make us afraid, we'll surrender our homes rather than fight. But she's forgotten something important about communities like ours. We didn't come to Willowbrook because we were afraid of challenges. We came here because we believed in building something better for our families. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each of us. We are not victims anymore. We are neighbors. We are friends. We are a community. And communities don't surrender their homes to bullies. As we prepared to leave Sarah's house that night, stepping out into the October rain that drummed against the windows of our threatened neighborhood, I realized that something fundamental had changed. We'd entered that living room as individual homeowners facing impossible odds. We were leaving as a united front, with the resources, knowledge, and determination to fight back. Margaret Whitmore had spent years dividing and conquering, isolating residents and picking them off one by one. But she'd made a critical error in pushing all of us to the breaking point simultaneously. She'd forced us to find each other. And now that we had, she was about to discover that communities are much stronger than empires built on fear. The real battle was just beginning. The morning of November 15th dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of sharp autumn air that makes everything feel charged with possibility. By 8 a.m., more than 200 people had gathered on the steps of the Whitmore County Courthouse, my courthouse, carrying signs, chanting slogans, and creating the kind of media spectacle that Margaret Whitmore had never imagined possible. David Vance's story had broken 3 days earlier on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, with the headline, HOA Foreclosure Scam: How One Pennsylvania Community Became a Real Estate Gold Mine. The article was devastating in its detail, methodically laying out Margaret's systematic targeting of vulnerable residents, her financial partnership with the development company, and the millions of dollars in fraudulent fines that had driven families from their homes. But it was the revelation about my courthouse ownership that had turned a local story into national news. Within hours of the Inquirer's publication, CNN, NPR, and the major networks were sending crews to Willowbrook. The narrative was irresistible. The small homeowner who discovered he owned the very courthouse where his oppressor planned to destroy him. Margaret had tried to get ahead of the story, calling an emergency HOA meeting and issuing a statement that dismissed the allegations as disgruntled residents, spreading false information to avoid paying legitimate fines. But the documentation Robert Sterling had provided was too comprehensive, too detailed, and too damning to dismiss as mere complaints. The legal showdown had been inevitable once our coalition filed formal complaints with the State Attorney General's office, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. But it was Margaret who'd forced the timeline by filing for emergency court orders to accelerate foreclosure proceedings against 12 properties, including mine. She'd thought speed would work in her favor. She was wrong. I stood on the courthouse steps, looking out over the crowd of supporters, media crews, and curious onlookers who'd come to witness what the morning news had called the Battle for Willowbrook. Mrs. Chen stood to my right, dignified in her best dress and carrying a folder of historical documents. Sarah Mackenzie was on my left, with 8-year-old Emma holding her hand and wearing a T-shirt that read, "This is my home too." Miguel Rodriguez had organized the crowd with the precision of a veteran activist, positioning supporters strategically around the courthouse entrance and ensuring that every news camera would capture the diversity of our coalition. Signs reading, "Communities over profits," "HOAs are not above the law," and Margaret Whitmore, corporate bully, created a visual backdrop that reinforced our message. But it was the banner stretched across the courthouse entrance that delivered the most powerful statement. "Welcome to the People's Courthouse. Justice for sale ends here." Inside, the largest courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to Sarah, but a jurist with a reputation for fairness and a particular intolerance for procedural abuse, presided over what would become a landmark case in HOA law. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table with 3 expensive lawyers, her silver hair perfect as always, her expression carefully controlled. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped her purse with white-knuckled intensity. For the first time in 7 years, she was not in control of the battlefield. Our legal team was smaller but more focused. We'd been fortunate to secure representation from the public interest law firm of Philadelphia, whose housing rights attorneys had been looking for exactly this kind of case to challenge predatory HOA practices. Lead attorney Jennifer Walsh was young but formidable, with a track record of taking on powerful interests and winning. The morning began with Margaret's lawyers arguing for immediate foreclosure relief, claiming that the defendants, us, were simply refusing to pay legitimate fines, and using media attention to avoid their legal obligations. It was a straightforward argument that might have worked in other circumstances, but those other circumstances wouldn't have included the courthouse owner sitting at the defense table. Your Honor, Jennifer Walsh began her response. Before we address the substance of these foreclosure actions, we need to address a fundamental conflict of interest that undermines the legitimacy of these proceedings. She gestured toward me. My client, Thomas Henderson, is not merely a defendant in these actions. He is also the owner of this courthouse building, having inherited the property from his grandfather 5 years ago. Every foreclosure proceeding, every fine collection action, every legal maneuver the plaintiff has undertaken has been conducted in a building owned by one of their primary targets. The murmur that ran through the courtroom was audible even over Judge Morrison's gavel. Margaret's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Charles Brennan, was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Property ownership is irrelevant to the legal merits of these cases. Judge Morrison leaned forward with interest. Actually, Mr. Brennan, I think it's quite relevant to the question of venue and potential conflicts of interest. Ms. Walsh, please continue. What followed was a systematic demolition of Margaret's entire operation, built around evidence that had been years in the making but weeks in the organizing. Robert Sterling testified about the internal operations of the HOA board, describing the targeting lists, the partnership with Whitmore Premium Properties, and the deliberate escalation of fines designed to force foreclosures rather than collect legitimate fees. Rajesh Patel presented his data analysis, showing the mathematical impossibility that violation patterns could be random. His charts and graphs made the discrimination visible in ways that were impossible to dismiss or explain away. Mrs. Chen testified about the historical promises made to original residents and the systematic violation of the original HOA charter provisions that were designed to protect homeowners from exactly this kind of abuse. But it was Sarah Mackenzie's testimony that provided the emotional core of our case. My daughter Emma is 8 years old, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. When the CPS investigators came to her school, she thought she was in trouble. She thought she'd done something wrong. For weeks afterward, she would ask me every morning if today was the day we'd have to leave our home. Sarah looked directly at Margaret as she continued. A child should never have to wonder if her home is safe. A child should never have to learn that adults will lie about her family to get what they want. Mrs. Whitmore turned my neighborhood into a war zone, and she used my daughter as a weapon against me. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Sarah finished her testimony. Even Margaret's lawyers seemed reluctant to cross-examine her. But the knockout blow came from David Vance, whose investigative research had uncovered the broader scope of Margaret's operations. This isn't just about Willowbrook, he testified. Mrs. Whitmore and her partners have been running similar operations in 3 other communities across southeastern Pennsylvania. We've identified at least 40 families who've lost their homes to this same foreclosure scheme over the past 5 years. He presented documentation showing the flow of money from forced sales to Whitmore Premium Properties, the consistent below-market purchase prices, and the subsequent resales at enormous profits. It was a real estate scam that had generated millions of dollars in illegal profits, while destroying communities and families. Margaret's defense crumbled under the weight of evidence. Her lawyers tried to argue that all violations were legitimate, all fines were properly assessed, and all procedures were followed according to HOA bylaws. But they couldn't explain the targeting patterns, the inflated penalties, or the financial partnerships that created obvious conflicts of interest. The final blow came when Jennifer Walsh introduced evidence of Margaret's attempts to interfere with our investigation. Robert Sterling had worn a wire to a recent HOA board meeting, recording Margaret's explicit instructions to make the troublemakers' lives as miserable as possible until they give up and move. You can't let them think they can challenge us. Margaret's voice filled the courtroom through the speaker system. Once word gets out that residents can fight back successfully, we'll lose control of the entire operation. Make examples of them. Use whatever means necessary. The recordings were devastating, but it was Margaret's reaction that sealed her fate, as her own voice echoed through the courtroom, describing residents as troublemakers and referring to community members as obstacles to be eliminated. Her carefully constructed facade finally cracked. She lunged toward Robert Sterling, screaming accusations of betrayal and conspiracy, before her lawyers could restrain her. The outburst was captured by every camera in the room and would be replayed on news programs for weeks afterward. Judge Morrison called for order, but the damage was done. Margaret Whitmore, the imperious HOA president, who'd terrorized a community for years, had revealed herself to be exactly what we'd always known, a bully whose power depended entirely on other people's fear. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. All foreclosure actions were immediately suspended. All fines levied in the past 2 years were declared invalid, pending a full audit of HOA operations. The current HOA board was placed under court supervision, with Margaret Whitmore specifically barred from any leadership role. But perhaps most importantly, Judge Morrison ordered a complete investigation into the financial relationships between the HOA and Whitmore Premium Properties, with criminal referrals to be made if evidence of fraud was discovered. As we walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, past the cheering crowd and news cameras, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine peace. Margaret Whitmore's empire of fear had crumbled in a single morning, brought down by the community she'd tried so hard to divide and conquer. The courthouse steps, where she'd planned to auction off our homes, had become the stage for her complete humiliation. But more than revenge, we'd achieved justice. 43 families would keep their homes. A community would heal from years of systematic abuse, and a precedent would be set that HOAs across the country could not prey on vulnerable residents with impunity. As Emma Mackenzie ran up the courthouse steps, laughing and playing with other neighborhood children, I realized we'd won something more valuable than a legal victory. We'd proven that communities are stronger than empires, that neighbors are more powerful than bullies, and that sometimes the person you're trying to crush owns the very ground you're standing on. Margaret Whitmore had taught us all an important lesson, though probably not the one she'd intended. Home isn't just a place you live, it's a place you fight for. 6 months after the courthouse showdown, Willowbrook looked like a different neighborhood entirely. Not because of any physical changes. The streets were still tree-lined, the houses still charming, the lawns still well-maintained. But the atmosphere had transformed from one of fear and suspicion to something approaching genuine community. I was trimming my hedge on a warm Saturday morning in May when Sarah Mackenzie walked by with Emma, both of them carrying canvas bags from the farmer's market that had recently been established in the community center parking lot. Emma ran up to my fence with the unconscious joy of a child who'd forgotten what it felt like to be afraid in her own neighborhood. "Mr. Henderson," she called out, her face bright with excitement. "Look what we got!" She held up a small potted plant with vibrant purple flowers. "Mrs. Chen taught me how to grow violets. She says they'll bloom all summer if I take good care of them." Sarah smiled as she caught up to her daughter. "Mrs. Chen has been teaching half the neighborhood about gardening. Did you know she used to run a nursery in Taiwan before she came to America?" I hadn't known that, but it was typical of what we'd all been discovering about each other in the months since Margaret Whitmore's reign of terror had ended. When you're not living in constant fear of violation notices and harassment, you have time to actually get to know your neighbors as people rather than fellow victims. The legal aftermath had been swift and comprehensive. The state attorney general's investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations that led to criminal charges against Margaret and 3 of her co-conspirators. Robert Sterling, who'd cooperated fully with the investigation, received immunity in exchange for his testimony. Margaret herself had been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution to affected homeowners. Whitmore Premium Properties had been dissolved, with its assets used to compensate families who'd lost their homes to the foreclosure scheme. The 12 properties that had been illegally seized were returned to their original owners at no cost, with the development company forced to absorb the financial losses. But the personal justice, satisfying as it was, had been less important than the community healing that followed. The new HOA board, elected by an overwhelming margin in a special election held 3 weeks after the court ruling, looked nothing like Margaret's authoritarian hierarchy. Mrs. Chen served as president, bringing 7 decades of wisdom and a fundamental belief that communities should serve their residents rather than the other way around. Miguel Rodriguez was vice president, his union organizing experience proving invaluable in building consensus around shared goals rather than imposed mandates. Sarah Mackenzie had been elected secretary, her experience as a working single mother bringing a practical perspective to discussions about community policies that actually had to work for real families. Even Robert Sterling had found redemption, serving as treasurer and applying his accounting skills to ensure the HOA's finances were transparent and properly managed. The new board's first action had been to reduce HOA fees by 40% and eliminate most of the petty regulations that had made daily life feel like walking through a minefield. The approved paint colors expanded from 12 options to any color that doesn't actively assault the retinas. The grass height requirement changed from precisely 2.5 inches to maintained in a reasonably neat manner. The architectural review process was streamlined from a months-long bureaucratic nightmare to a simple notification system for major modifications. But more importantly, the new board had established a community mediation program for resolving disputes without fines, penalties, or threats. When conflicts arose, and they still did, because neighbors are human, trained volunteer mediators helped people work through problems with conversation rather than coercion. The changes weren't just procedural. The community center, which had been used primarily for Margaret's authoritarian board meetings, had been transformed into a genuine gathering place. The farmers' market brought local vendors every Saturday. Evening classes offered everything from Mrs. Chen's gardening workshops to Miguel's Spanish conversation groups to Sarah's single parents' support meetings. Rajesh and Meera Patel had started a neighborhood tech support group, helping elderly residents navigate everything from smartphone apps to online banking. Their teenage children taught computer skills while learning about different cultures and traditions from their older neighbors. Even the physical spaces had been opened up. The community pool, which had been governed by a complex set of rules about who could use it when and under what circumstances, became a genuine neighborhood gathering place where children played together while their parents actually talked to each other instead of eyeing each other suspiciously for potential violations. David Vance had continued covering our story, documenting the transformation from authoritarian control to genuine community self-governance. His follow-up articles had inspired similar resistance movements in HOA-controlled communities across the country, with our Willowbrook model being studied by community organizers and legal advocates from California to Connecticut. The national attention had been overwhelming at first, with reporters and documentary crews wanting to capture our story. But we'd been selective about media access, working with David to ensure that coverage focused on the broader issues of HOA reform rather than just the dramatic personal elements of our particular battle. One of the most meaningful changes had been the establishment of the Willowbrook Community Land Trust, a legal structure that would prevent future exploitation of vulnerable residents. Using part of the restitution money from Margaret's conviction, we'd purchased several properties that would be permanently maintained as affordable housing for working families, elderly residents, and others who might otherwise be priced out of the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen had been the driving force behind the land trust, drawing on her knowledge of community ownership, models from other countries, and her understanding of how easily neighborhoods could be transformed from communities into commodities. Property ownership should serve community building, she'd explained, to the packed community center meeting where we'd voted to establish the trust. When housing becomes just another way to extract profit from working families, we lose the foundation of what makes a neighborhood worth living in. The trust had also given us a way to honor the families who'd been forced out during Margaret's reign. We'd reached out to everyone we could locate, offering them the opportunity to return to Willowbrook with housing assistance and community support. Some had moved too far away or rebuilt their lives elsewhere. But several families had come home, bringing with them stories of resilience and forgiveness that enriched our collective understanding of what community really meant. My own role in the neighborhood had evolved in ways I'd never expected. The courthouse ownership, which had started as a lucky accident, had become a platform for broader housing rights advocacy. I'd worked with legal organizations across Pennsylvania to establish the Henderson Foundation, which provided legal support for homeowners facing abusive HOA practices. The foundation had already handled more than 50 cases in its first 6 months, using the Willowbrook precedent to challenge predatory practices in communities throughout the region. We'd won most of the cases, but more importantly, we'd established legal precedents that made it much harder for future Margaret Whitmores to operate with impunity. But perhaps the most satisfying change was the simplest one. Willowbrook felt like home again. Children rode bicycles, without their parents worrying about unapproved recreational activities. Neighbors planted gardens based on what they wanted to grow rather than what was permitted by regulation. People painted their front doors in colors they actually liked. Families hung holiday decorations without measuring them against complex guidelines designed to eliminate any expression of individual personality. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some longtime residents had initially struggled with the transition from rigid rule-following to community self-governance. A few families had actually moved away, finding the new openness and diversity less comfortable than Margaret's authoritarian predictability. But for most of us, the changes had been liberating in ways both large and small. The neighborhood felt alive again, with the kind of gentle chaos that comes from real people living real lives rather than performing compliance with arbitrary regulations. As Emma Mackenzie ran back toward her house with her potted violets, stopping to show them to Mr. Rodriguez, who was working in his garden, I realized that we'd achieved something more valuable than just victory over Margaret Whitmore. We'd proven that communities could heal themselves, that neighbors could learn to trust each other again, and that home was something you built together rather than something imposed by authorities. The courthouse steps, where Margaret had planned to auction off our homes, now hosted the farmers' market information booth. The community center where she'd held her authoritarian board meetings now echoed with children's laughter and adult conversation. The streets where her agents had photographed violations now rang with the sounds of neighbors helping neighbors with everything from moving furniture to babysitting children. Willowbrook had become what it was always supposed to be, not a collection of individual properties managed by a corporation, but a community of people choosing to build something together. Margaret Whitmore had tried to teach us that power came from fear, control, and the ability to threaten other people's security. Instead, she'd accidentally taught us that real power comes from connection, mutual support, and the courage to stand up for each other. It was a lesson worth learning, even at the cost of nearly losing our homes to learn it. 2 years after the courthouse showdown, I found myself standing in front of a congressional subcommittee in Washington, D.C., explaining how a neighborhood dispute in Pennsylvania had become a national model for HOA reform. The room was formal and intimidating, filled with representatives, policy experts, and advocates who'd come to discuss the Homeowners' Bill of Rights. legislation directly inspired by our battle in Willowbrook. The fundamental question, I told the subcommittee, isn't whether homeowners associations serve a legitimate purpose. They do. The question is whether communities exist to serve their residents, or whether residents exist to serve the financial interests of those who control their communities. The hearing was the culmination of 2 years of advocacy work that had grown organically from our local victory. What had started as a desperate fight to save our homes had evolved into a nationwide movement to reform the legal structures that governed more than 70 million Americans living in HOA-controlled communities. The Henderson Foundation had processed more than 800 cases in its first 2 years, documenting patterns of abuse that stretched across all 50 states. We discovered that Margaret Whitmore's operation, while particularly egregious, was part of a much larger problem: the transformation of homeowners associations from community service organizations into profit-driven enterprises that treated residents as revenue sources rather than neighbors. Our research had revealed that approximately 15% of HOAs exhibited predatory practices similar to those we'd faced in Willowbrook. That represented more than 10 million Americans living under regimes of systematic harassment, excessive fines, and threats of foreclosure designed to generate profits rather than maintain community standards. But we'd also discovered something more hopeful: communities fighting back successfully, using the legal and organizational strategies we'd developed in Willowbrook as templates for their own resistance movements. In Arizona, the Sunrise Meadows community had used our model to challenge a board that was charging residents $300 per violation notice, even for violations that didn't exist. In Florida, the Palmetto Heights neighborhood had stopped a foreclosure scheme that targeted elderly residents on fixed incomes. In Texas, the Oak Creek community had dissolved their predatory management company and established a resident-controlled governance structure. Each victory had added to our understanding of what worked, what didn't, and how communities could protect themselves from exploitation while still maintaining reasonable standards and shared infrastructure. Mrs. Chen, now 75 and still serving as Willowbrook's HOA president, had become an unlikely national spokesperson for community-controlled governance. Her philosophy was simple but revolutionary. Communities should be run by the people who live in them, for the benefit of the people who live in them. Everything else is just business dressed up as neighbors. She testified before state legislatures in 12 states, sharing her wisdom about the difference between leadership and control, between community standards and authoritarian micromanagement. Her gentle but firm approach had helped convince skeptical lawmakers that HOA reform wasn't about eliminating all rules, but about ensuring that rules served community building rather than community exploitation. Miguel Rodriguez had taken his organizing skills national, establishing the Community Rights Network that helped neighborhoods across the country build coalitions capable of challenging abusive HOA practices. His training workshops taught residents how to document violations, organize resistance, navigate legal procedures, and sustain long-term campaigns for reform. The most important thing people need to understand, Miguel often said in his presentations, is that you're not fighting alone. Every community that stands up to bullies makes it easier for the next community to stand up. Every victory creates precedent that helps other neighborhoods win their own battles. Sarah Mackenzie had returned to school, earning a law degree with a focus on housing rights and community advocacy. Her thesis project had become a handbook for single parents facing HOA harassment, providing practical advice on everything from documenting discrimination to accessing legal resources. The handbook had been downloaded more than 100,000 times and translated into 8 languages. Her daughter, Emma, now 10, had become an inadvertent symbol of what community battles meant for children. Her essay about the time the grown-ups saved our neighborhood had been published in Highlights magazine and reprinted in newspapers across the country. But more importantly, Emma had grown up understanding that adults could work together to solve problems, that communities could heal themselves, and that her voice mattered in decisions that affected her home. David Vance had won a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative series on HOA abuse, but he'd used the recognition to launch a broader examination of how corporate interests had infiltrated community governance structures. His book, The Privatization of Home: How America's Neighborhoods Became Profit Centers, had become required reading in urban planning and public policy programs. Across the country, Robert Sterling had found redemption through service, using his accounting skills to help communities establish transparent financial systems that prevented the kind of corruption he'd witnessed firsthand. His consulting work with the Henderson Foundation had helped dozens of neighborhoods identify and eliminate predatory financial practices. Even the courthouse had played a continuing role in our story. I'd negotiated a new lease with Whitmore County that included provisions for community access to legal resources, expanded public meeting spaces, and a commitment to prioritize housing rights cases. The building had become a symbol of how public institutions could serve community interests rather than just institutional ones. But perhaps the most important legacy was the simplest one. Willowbrook itself had become proof that communities could govern themselves with wisdom, compassion, and effectiveness. Our neighborhood now served as a case study for urban planning programs, a destination for delegations from other communities seeking to understand how resident-controlled governance actually worked in practice. We hosted workshops, published guides, and shared our experiences with anyone willing to listen and learn. The results spoke for themselves. Property values in Willowbrook had increased by 23% since we'd eliminated the authoritarian management structure, not because of stricter rules, but because people wanted to live in a community where neighbors took care of each other. Crime had decreased to near zero, not because of surveillance and penalties, but because residents knew and looked out for each other. Children who'd grown up under Margaret's regime of fear had blossomed into confident, engaged community members. Elderly residents who'd been isolated by harassment and intimidation had become treasured neighborhood resources, sharing their knowledge and experience with younger families. The community center hosted everything from child care cooperatives to senior support groups to small business incubators. The farmers' market had grown into a regional destination that brought economic benefits throughout the area. The Community Land Trust had preserved affordability while maintaining neighborhood character. Most importantly, Willowbrook had demonstrated that the choice between community standards and community freedom was a false one. When residents controlled their own governance, they consistently chose reasonable standards that served everyone's interests rather than arbitrary rules that served only the control needs of authorities. As I sat in that congressional hearing room, answering questions about policy recommendations and legal reforms, I thought about Emma McKenzie running through the neighborhood with her friends, laughing and playing without fear. I thought about Mrs. Chen tending her garden while teaching neighbors about plants and patience. I thought about Miguel and Sarah organizing the next community potluck, bringing together families from different backgrounds around shared tables and shared hopes. The legislative reforms we were advocating, requirements for financial transparency, limitations on fine and fee structures, protections against discriminatory enforcement, provisions for community control over governance were important and necessary, but they were also just the beginning. The real legacy of our battle wasn't legal precedent or policy reform, though those mattered. The real legacy was the proof that communities could take care of themselves, that neighbors could work together to solve problems, and that home was something you built together rather than something imposed by authorities. Margaret Whitmore had taught us, entirely against her will, that power ultimately belongs to the people who choose to use it responsibly. She'd shown us that bullies only win when good people don't organize to stop them. She demonstrated that communities are stronger than corporations, that neighbors are more powerful than profit margins, and that justice doesn't require courthouse steps. Sometimes it just requires people who care enough about each other to stand up and fight. As I walked out of the Capitol building that afternoon, past the protesters and tourists and lobbyists who make up the daily theater of democracy, I felt a deep gratitude for the accidental education Margaret Whitmore had provided. She'd tried to teach us that we were powerless. Instead, she'd taught us exactly how powerful we really were. She'd tried to teach us that community was about compliance. Instead, she'd taught us that community was about choice. She'd tried to teach us that home was a commodity to be managed. Instead, she'd taught us that home was a relationship to be nurtured. The legislation we were advocating would help other communities avoid the trauma we'd experienced. The legal precedents we'd established would protect future residents from predatory practices. The organizing models we'd developed would help neighborhoods build power before they needed to use it. But the most important lesson was one that couldn't be written into law or reduced to policy recommendations. That ordinary people, working together with courage and determination, could create the kind of communities where children felt safe, where neighbors took care of each other, and where home meant belonging rather than simply owning. That lesson would outlive all of us, carried forward by every family that chose community over isolation, by every neighbor who chose cooperation over competition, by every child who grew up understanding that adults could work together to make things better. Margaret Whitmore had demanded $200,000 and gotten a lifetime prison sentence, but in the process, she'd accidentally given us something priceless: the knowledge that we were stronger together than any of us could ever be alone. It was a gift that would keep giving, one community at a time, one neighbor at a time, one home at a time, forever.